Creating Engagement in the Classroom, Understanding the Challenges of the Modern-Day Learning Environment
is written by Kevin Popovic and Ryan Vanshur.
Welcome to another webinar in our series, Creating Engagement in the Classroom. I'm Kevin Popovic, a lecturer at San Diego State University. Today we're going to discuss a topic that is fundamental to the higher education learning process, providing answers to questions. The student raises their hand, the educator provides an answer, and that's it, right? Well, not quite. More on that later.
I'm Ryan Vanshur, and I'm an undergraduate student here at San Diego State and co-author of the ebook with Kevin, Creating Engagement in the Classroom. And today's webinar is titled Providing Answers to Questions, and we're very excited to bring you some of our thought-provoking analysis and discussion around this topic.
So, an overview of today's webinar. We'll start with where did all the questions go, then move to the professor's view, and of course the student's view, and how to bring the questions back. What does the current research say? How do we build upon this research? And of course, Ryan, at the end, questions and answers.
So Kevin, today let's talk higher education specifically, right? There's a lot of obstacles that we've mentioned that are faced by both students and professors, right? And so with class sizes getting bigger, the individual or the opportunities for individual interaction we've noted have fallen, and that includes the ability to ask questions, right? And so when a single professor is in charge of presenting, I've seen up to 1-2 chapters of content at any given time, anywhere ranging from 50-minute to 2-hour lectures. There's very, very little time for you to actually take questions, especially when there's numerous students, because you don't really know how many responses you're going to get. And so this creates challenges on both sides of the podium, right? And so Ben Franklin, I think, famously said, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn." And I think the ability to ask questions is sort of one of the more priority sources of involvement that we see in the classroom. I think Einstein touched on it also. He said that the important thing is to never stop questioning, and being able to create a bridge between the teachers and students. That way they can still ask questions, receive the answers, has always been important in the classroom. But when the learning environment doesn't necessarily support that, which are some of the classrooms that we're sitting in today, you start to see student expression get stifled, and it becomes less a part of the learning journey, right? And so, as you mentioned, I think the big question is, as a professor, where did all your questions go?
Well, I think the shift largely occurred because in the past, higher education classrooms were much smaller and more personalized. They required more involvement than attending an hour-long voiceover PowerPoint presentation. The teacher taught and the student followed along, raising their hand when they had a question about the lesson of the day. So if a student is no longer asking questions, it's important to point out that it might not always be a bad thing. The student already knows the material so well questions aren't necessary. More often than not, though, the cause is one of three things. First, they're not sure what to ask. Second, they want to avoid the embarrassment of seeing like they don't understand the material, and then they don't want to hold up the progress of the lecture. All right, those aren't promising reasons, though, are they? So now professors are vary in the extent which they encourage questions and in the ways they respond to them. Some welcome questions, others do not. Some tolerate questions, while others expect questions. Styles do vary.
Yeah, and I've actually talked with educators who note that questions from students are a pretty good indicator of how well they're actually tracking the material too, right? And so as content and class culture dictates, every class is as different as the professor that's teaching it. But when the professor simply can't find the time to take questions, students that typically need to learn or at least ask questions and explore topics, if they're not provided that channel of communication, it could be a difficult time with a class, under that specific instructor. And so then you have a choice, right? And so do you make a plan for alternate channels to take questions, or do you just hope that the students are left to, answer the questions themselves amongst each other, right? And asking questions is obviously a proven way for students to fill gaps in their knowledge. And we know that good questions can also, help students, one, avoid wasting time, trying to figure out if, one, they're interpreting directions clear or, completing tasks incorrectly. But it also, students can use these questions to help the professor determine if they're actually moving too fast in the lecture or at a pace that just is not allowing the rest of the class to follow along. And so when we think about where are the questions going, I think the next question is, how are we able to bring questions back into the classroom setting?
Well, as classrooms grow in physical size, the distance between the teacher and a student in the back of the room increases as well. The volume necessary to hear the lesson increases while the professor's ability to be heard decreases. The student-teacher relationship may never form simply because of this physical distance. So without a quality microphone and amplified speakers, many in the audience will get less than the best of the classroom performance. It's a two-way street. The teacher might also miss the best from the student contributions because the technology wasn't in place to facilitate audible communications. For instance, a student sitting in the back of my class won't scream their question from the back row. Whether they feel it's not worth the embarrassment or they are just the quiet kid in class, most feel that they are disrupting the students around them while they still barely reaching me at the podium. Now, as classrooms grow in student density, the number of points a teacher must connect with also increases. If the goal is to address every student every day, a 30-second touch for a class of 100 students requires 50 minutes of conversation. Even fractional applications total much more time than many educators allocate to their lessons plans. There's just too much to cover to meet the perceived goals. So the classroom can become a series of compromises to serve many masters, management, students, and our teaching ethos. And depending on whom we speak with, a new tipping can occur. So the challenge is real.
So for myself, again, I'm a first-generation college student, and so I take my education, pretty seriously. And so I've sat through lectures that had been packed with up to 500 students, and I learned very quickly that if I was, going to have any chance at getting any questions answered, you have to sit front row, front center. And so even with that approach, though, sometimes it wasn't even the most effective. Like I can remember quite a few times where, I would throw my hand up in the air because I really needed to ask a question to move forward in the lecture, because things just weren't clicking for me. And, I would see the professor catch me out of the corner of his eye, and, do the I can't really, see you thing. And I would end up, sitting there until my arm got tired and I never got the question answered. But I definitely tried, right? And so I really needed those to advance through the lecture. I spent a lot of time having to reteach myself material as a result of not really being able to get those questions answered. And there was a time I didn't take advantage of office hours because of my health issues. So after interviewing other students, again, this goes back to when we were first getting involved in trying to solve some of these problems. I found that I wasn't, at all alone in that experience, and that there was a lot of my classmates who had the same type of feedback, right? And so I was speaking with Alec. He was a senior last semester who had graduated, and he was talking about his first semester at SDSU. And he had said, I just could not keep up with the material that was being presented to me in class. Although I needed clarification on the material, the professor viewed questions as a disturbance to his lecture, so I never bothered to ask. Another student, Marissa, she was a junior, so she'll be a senior right now. She was saying, I really like when my professor makes me feel like I have one-on-one access to them, even in lectures, right? And that's something I think very rare. Sydney, another student from SDSU, senior last semester, had mentioned that even when she wants to ask her professor questions in class, she gets really nervous, to even raise her hand, and she would let these questions go unanswered. And when nobody else is asking questions, specifically she said that, she doesn't want to be the one that raises her hand and says that, I don't get it.
Current solutions for reestablishing the question and answer relationship between students and their professors come in several forms. So today we have options, each with its own set of pros and cons. So here are some of the leading solutions for today's classrooms. The simple answer to building or rebuilding relationship is to bring back the questions and answers to the classroom. Build time into your lesson plan that includes a break for questions and for the teacher to give solid answers. We know in most cases if one student is asking, others are not, so the professor can make time in advance to deliberately and clearly ask the students if they have any questions. Since he or she planned for this open forum session, there will be plenty of time to provide an adequate response as well.
Mm-hmm. And so we've also heard that there's a few professors, right, who survey students at the end of every class. And so what this does is it actually allows for that disruption of the class period. And with this method particularly, the teacher can, basically give a form at the end of the class and just ask for, tell me your biggest takeaway from this lecture, or are there any questions that you would like addressed next course? And what this does is it gives them enough time to also prepare, a thoughtful response in a more efficient manner, while also preserving, the anonymity of the students who generally didn't want to speak up in the class for those exact reasons that they wanted to remain anonymous. So I think that's another key thing is, using survey forms is a pretty traditional but also proven strategy. For like technology solutions, when we were designing Course Key, we built this to enable students to input their questions, through any device that they're using in the classroom, and allow the professor to field those questions at any time that they feel is needed. And so what this did was we really wanted to give students that equal opportunity to ask their questions, and ensure the deliverability of the question to the teacher. And so this applies not just to the questions, but also the concerns and comments. So we're seeing a lot more qualitative feedback being given as well. So this is saving students the competition and gives them a better chance of having their voice heard, as opposed to the old traditional method of sitting right in the front of the center of the class, and potentially being disruptive just to make sure that your learning is being taken care of. Another thing we like to do with course keys, we really like to allow students to remain anonymous. We had done some polling, and 50% of students had said that they would interact more in class if they could remain anonymous in their responses. And so when we see teachers, they'll still see who submitted the information, which is nice, but the student will have the option of saying, hey, I'd like to remain anonymous, don't use my name. And I think that's something that they appreciate, because then you have more student expression in your courses.
Well, the nature of the classroom is that information is delivered to students via some means, right? Speaking, video, PowerPoint, etc. However, students have varying learning styles and may not always gauge the information the same way as each other. Some students prefer visuals, while others like audio. Some prefer a combination of both. So some students are too intimidated to ask questions in front of a room full of their peers. So they still have questions, but they may not have the equal opportunity to ask the teacher due to any number of constraints. As students have pointed out above, this creates a problem. Throughout history, advances in classroom technology profoundly impacted the learning experience. When the technology arrived, we moved from blackboards to smartboards, right? Hello, multifunctionality, goodbye, sloppy handwriting, and screechy chalk. So as the question and answer relationship changes, we need to look for similar solutions. So the best solution will be one that reaches the most students in the most efficient manner, while still allowing the professor to use his or her expertise and judgment to deliver a cohesive, educational, and engaging lesson plan.
Absolutely. And also, we can't forget that education requires communication between the teacher and the student, synchronous or asynchronous. And it's the basis for learning and the foundation, obviously, for creating the relationship in the classroom. And without that ability to ask the questions and get the answers, which is, the entire dynamics of learning, a class could, be more accurately considered, training as opposed to a learning.
Right, and then add a professor's perspective here. It is true that unanswered questions are avoidable in the classroom. They just have to be addressed as part of the course content. The tools and technologies are available to professors to include in their presentation and can unleash boundless amounts of information to be explored and shared with the motivation that may already exist. It simply comes down to providing a channel for students and teachers and giving them the tools to utilize it. Now, throughout this blog series, we examine the constantly evolving world of education. As classroom sizes grow, the interactions between teachers and students become increasingly limited. Educators need to work now more than ever to revive student expression in the classroom. Most importantly, it's not too late to heal this relationship. With the assistance of educational technology in the classroom, educators can once more engage their students and rebuild the culture of classroom curiosity and interaction that leads to mutual success.
So Q&A session looks like it's coming up, and obviously great points, going over the Q&A and why it's important, in the classroom, and it's also important here in our webinars. So the first one I wanted to hit you a question was for you. Again, we go back to teaching creativity and innovation, which is fairly unique. How do you encourage curiosity in these types of classes, as a professor in higher education? Then also, how do you ensure that your students, questions and concerns are, at least providing some value to their learning, or how do you take care of your students, KP?
Well, I think that curiosity in the classroom is how you go about doing it is related to the material. Right, so there's different things that you want students to be curious about, right? So in my class, I find that by using a lot of different types of content, I can break up a big lesson into smaller lessons, and by varying the content, I can keep them engaged, right? Because the first thing we may be doing is a game, all right, and then the game may go to a video, and the video goes to a lecture, right, and then the lecture may have a short quiz associated to it, and then there's usually an exercise associated by that. So I think that curiosity comes with engagement. I think when you provide content that is interesting and demonstrates some relative purpose to the class, I think that's a great start. I think limiting how big of a bite of content is also allows them to kind of keep consuming, right? To go right into like to do a 2.5 hour lecture on one chapter. I don't care how interesting the chapter is, at some point you really get kind of burnt out about it. Mm-hmm. But if you can do, but I think it's much more feasible to maintain curiosity by giving them, a 10-minute game, a 5-minute video, a 15-minute lecture, a 5-minute quiz. All these smaller pieces, I think, really lead to engagement. Not only in my class, but I think in anybody who can adopt this kind of structure, it just makes it much more interesting. And I think as long as you maintain interest, you can maintain curiosity, right? Active interest.
Yeah.
So let's put one in your court, Ryan. What can a professor do to make you feel more comfortable in class, right? What makes you feel more encouraged to ask questions and participate?
Well, I guess that's an interesting one. One of the first things is obviously, I think you had mentioned, I think more frequency of, touches with the material and making sure that there's more opportunities to gauge your own understanding. When you kind of, bust everything down to, we're going to do an hour lecture and then you're going to ask me questions at the end. You have to really think about what questions, write them down, ask them. But if you have some pauses in between to make the length of the class more digestible and do it in 15-minute segments with some sort of feedback mechanism or loop for students to be able to contribute to the conversation and kind of explore the ideas throughout the course of the lecture, I think that's a lot more warming rather than, waiting till the hour and 15 minutes is over and then fielding questions where it could have been way too overwhelming by the time you get to that point. So I think more frequent, questioning strategies built into the lecture is one way. The second way I think is also giving students that ability. There was a quote that I heard the other day that I thought was interesting, and he basically said, if students aren't learning the way you teach, why don't you teach the way they learn? And I think that kind of directly ties in, if you're not taking, if students aren't giving you questions in the way you're asking, why don't you ask them questions in the way that they prefer? And I think that goes back to, giving more of that digital voice to the students who aren't going to speak up even if you ask them to. If you called them out randomly out of the hat, there's just some who are not going to talk because of the way they are. Now, if you just said, everybody pull out your device and give me your feedback, or that's one of the things I like, the novelty of the iClicker, where students for the first time could all contribute to a question as opposed to, the 3 guys in the front of the class who always answer every question for everybody. And I think just being able to provide those avenues with more student expression, giving everybody a chance to contribute would also, create more, comfort in certain terms of the classroom environment.
Well, great conversation, Ryan. I really think that that's something professors can keep in mind moving forward to enhance the learning in their classrooms. And on that, we do conclude our 5th webinar now. And even though this one's winding down, our conversations still continue.
That's right. And so you can actually download this ebook, Creating Engagement in the Classroom, if you want to learn more about how to create engagement in your classroom and in your lectures. And this, again, whether you're a teacher or a student, this is for both sides of the podium to learn together, right? And so you can add your comments to the blogs. It can be found on our website, creatingengagementintheclassroom.org. And also, don't forget to follow our conversations on social media and use the hashtag #CreatingEngagement.
Well, thanks for joining our conversation, and please consider sharing this with your fellow educators and students so they can share their experience, opinions, and experiences as well. Thanks, Ryan.
Yep, have a good one.
Creating Engagement in the Classroom, Understanding the Challenges of the Modern-Day Learning Environment is written by Kevin Popovic and Ryan Vanshur.
To learn more about creating engagement in your classroom, visit creatingengagementintheclassroom.org or follow hashtag #CreatingEngagement.